The desert wind carried death that morning. It whistled through the
Husband,
canyon walls like
you
a
could be our
widow's
husband.
wail, and Samuel Kane knew before he saw the smoke that something terrible had happened at the Henderson Ranch. He'd been tracking a wounded elk since dawn, following the blood trail through the mesquite and sage, when the acrid smell hit him. Not the clean smoke of a cooking fire or the sweet burn of cedar, but the bitter stench of destruction, of lives ending. Samuel spurred his horse toward the ridge, his weathered hands steady on the reins despite the dread pooling in his gut. At 42, he'd seen enough death to recognize its calling card from miles away. The war had taught him that. The frontier had reinforced it. And the grave he dug with his own hands 5 years ago had carved it into his bones. From the hilltop, he could see the Henderson place laid out below like a broken promise. The barn was nothing but charred beams and ash. The house still stood, but its windows were shattered, the door hanging off its hinges like a broken jaw. And there, in the yard where Martha Henderson used to hang her washing, 4 figures knelt in a row. 4 Apache women. Samuel's chest tightened. He knew what this meant. Knew it the way a man knows thunder follows lightning. The Hendersons were gone, and these women, these survivors, were all that remained of whatever violence had swept through this valley like a plague. He rode down slow, his Henry rifle across his lap, but not raised. The women didn't move as he approached. They stayed on their knees, hands folded, heads slightly bowed, but not in prayer. In waiting. In resignation to whatever fate would bring next. The eldest looked about 35, her long black hair braided with strips of leather that had seen better days. Even kneeling, she held herself with a dignity that transcended her torn deerskin dress. Beside her, a woman with fierce eyes and a scar across her collarbone watched him approach with the coiled tension of a rattlesnake. The third was smaller, gentler somehow, though her hands bore the calluses of hard work. And the youngest, she couldn't be more than 20, had eyes that held both defiance and desperation in equal measure. Samuel dismounted 20 feet away, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The morning sun cast long shadows across the devastation, and in that light he could see the blood on their clothes. Not their own blood, he realized. They'd been trying to help, trying to save whoever had been here. What happened? His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by years of cigarette smoke and frontier whiskey. The eldest woman raised her head. Her English was careful but clear. Raiders came in the night. White men, not Apache. They wanted the horses, the cattle. The Hendersons tried to fight. Samuel's jaw clenched. Tom Henderson had been a good man, fair to everyone, regardless of skin color. His wife Martha had been known to leave food out for traveling natives, never asking questions, never demanding payment. They'd had 2 kids, a boy of 12 and a girl of 9. The children. The fierce-eyed woman spoke this time, her voice sharp as flint. We tried. The fire was too strong. The weight of it settled on Samuel's shoulders like a yoke. 4 more graves to add to the frontier's endless tally. 4 more souls the desert would swallow without ceremony or justice. Why are you here? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. The youngest one looked up then, and her voice when it came was steady, despite the tears tracking through the dirt on her face. Our husbands rode with the Hendersons sometimes, traded horses. When we saw the smoke, we came, but we were too late. And now, the eldest woman's gaze didn't waver. Now we have nowhere else to go. The reservation agent says we cannot return without men to speak for us. The town. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The town does not welcome Apache widows. Samuel understood what she wasn't saying. 4 Apache women alone were vulnerable to every kind of evil the frontier could conjure. Without protection, without a place to belong, they were as good as dead. He looked at each of them in turn, seeing not savages as the town would call them, but survivors. Women who'd risked their own safety to help neighbors in need. women who now knelt in the ashes of someone else's tragedy, waiting to see if kindness or cruelty would find them first. The youngest one rose slightly on her knees, her hands spread in a gesture that was part plea, part offering. When she spoke the word she chose hit Samuel like a physical blow. "Husband," she said, "you could be our husband." The word hung in the desert air like a challenge, like a question, like a lifeline thrown across an impossible distance. Samuel felt his chest constrict, felt the old scar on his ribs burn with remembered pain. He'd buried that word 5 years ago, along with his wife and stillborn son. He'd sworn never to speak it again, never to be it again. But here in the ashes of the Henderson Ranch, with the desert wind carrying the smell of death, and these 4 women looking at him with eyes that held no hope except what he might offer, Samuel Kane felt something shift inside him. Not healing, he was too broken for that. But maybe, just maybe, the possibility of purpose. "Get up," he said finally. "No one kneels in the dirt on my account." As the women rose, Samuel caught sight of something glinting in the ruins of the house. A piece of Martha Henderson's china, somehow unbroken despite the violence that had swept through. It lay there like a sign, like a reminder that some things endure even when everything else falls apart. He didn't know yet that this moment would change everything. Didn't know that these 4 women would challenge every wall he'd built around his heart. Didn't know that the word husband would echo through his remaining days like a benediction and a curse combined. All he knew was that the desert had brought him here for a reason, and sometimes a man's fate is decided not by what he chooses, but by what he cannot turn away from. Samuel Kane's ranch sat 3 miles north of Perdition, a town that had earned its name through blood and broken promises. The land stretched out like a scar across the desert, 40 acres of stubborn grass and harder rock that fought him for every fence post, every well, every single head of cattle that survived the seasons. It wasn't much, but it was as bought with money earned from 10 years of scouting for the army, and another 5 breaking horses for men who had more land than sense. The house itself was modest, 3 rooms built from adobe and determination with a tin roof that sang in the rain and windows that faced east toward the mountains. He'd built it with his own hands with the help of his wife Elizabeth, back when they'd both believed the frontier could be tamed with enough sweat and hope. That was before the fever took her, before the baby came too early and too still, before Samuel learned that some things couldn't be fixed with hammer and nail. Now the house stood like a monument to solitude. Each room held its ghosts, Elizabeth's rocking chair that he couldn't bring himself to burn, the cradle he'd carved from pine that sat covered in the barn, the kitchen where her apron still hung on its peg, like she might walk in any moment and start making biscuits. 5 years of dust had settled on these memories, but Samuel hadn't disturbed them. Some men drank to forget. Samuel chose to remember, even when it hurt. The 4 Apache women stood in his doorway, like questions he wasn't ready to answer. In the better light of his kitchen, he could see them clearer, could read the stories written in their faces and hands. The eldest, who introduced herself as Ayanna, carried herself like she'd been born to lead. Her name meant eternal blossom in her tongue, she told him, though her eyes held winters that would never thaw. She'd been married to a horse trader, a man who'd walked between both worlds with the ease of someone who belonged to neither. When the cholera came through the reservation last summer, it took him in 3 days, left her with skills in healing trading and the kind of steel-spine survival that meant she'd rather die standing than live kneeling. "I know plants that heal and plants that harm," she said simply, her hands folded in her lap as she sat at his table. "I know how to make a dollar stretch to 10 and how to read the weather in the flight of birds. I am not asking for charity, Mr. Kane. I am offering partnership." Beside her sat Kaya, whose name meant wise child, though there was nothing childlike in her fierce gaze. The scar across her collarbone, Samuel learned, came from a cavalry saber during a raid 5 years back. Her husband had been a warrior who'd laid down his weapons for the reservation's promises of peace. When those promises broke, as they always did, he'd been shot by a trigger-happy settler who claimed self-defense. The Indian agent had believed the settler. Nobody had asked Kaya what she'd seen. "I can hunt," Kaya said, her voice carrying an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "Track deer, elk, even men if needed. I can shoot straight and ride harder than most cowboys you know. But I will not beg. Not from you. Not from anyone." The third woman, Neela, was quieter, her presence like water soft but persistent. She'd been married to a blacksmith, a man who'd learned his trade from missionaries and used it to shoe horses for anyone who could pay. He'd died 6 months ago when a horse kicked wrong crushed his skull against the anvil he'd worked for 10 years. Neela had tried to keep the business going, but nobody wanted to buy horseshoes from an Apache widow. "I cook, I sew, I keep houses," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know numbers can read some English. The missionaries taught me before." She trailed off something dark passing across her features. "Before they decided teaching Apaches was throwing pearls before swine." The youngest Suki was hardest to read, 20 years old, maybe 21, with eyes that held both innocence and calculation in equal measure. Her husband had been killed just 2 weeks ago, shot by rustlers who'd wanted his horses and hadn't wanted witnesses. She'd hidden in the root cellar, listened to him die, emerged to find his blood soaking into soil that would never wash clean. "I learned quick," Suki said, leaning forward slightly, her presence somehow filling more space than her small frame should allow. "Whatever you need, I learn. And I dream things sometimes. True things. I dreamed you before we met. A man with eyes like winter sky and hands that know both killing and kindness." Samuel felt the words settle on him like a weight. He poured coffee, thick and bitter as his thoughts, and considered what they were really asking. Not just shelter, not just protection, but something more complicated. In Apache tradition, he knew a woman without a husband was vulnerable to being claimed by any male relative of her dead spouse. If no relatives existed or wanted them, they became outcasts, surviving on the edges of society like ghosts. "The reservation won't take you back?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. Ayana's laugh was bitter as the coffee. "The agent says 4 women without men are 4 mouths that produce nothing. He suggested we find work in town." You know what kind of work he meant. Samuel did know. Perdition had 3 saloons and 2 brothels, and they were always looking for fresh faces to feed to the miners and cowboys who passed through. The thought of these women, proud and strong, despite their losses, reduced to that made his stomach turn. "Why me?" he asked finally. "There are other ranches, other men. Other men would use us and discard us," Kaya said bluntly. "You are known in town as a man who keeps to himself, who judges not by skin, but by action. The Hendersons spoke of you with respect, said you were broken, but not cruel." Broken but not cruel? Samuel almost laughed at the accuracy of it. He looked around his kitchen at the empty chairs that hadn't held guests in years, at the stove that cooked meals for one, at the walls that had heard no voices but his own curses, and occasionally late at night his wife's name spoken to the darkness. "I'm not looking for wives," he said carefully. "I buried my wife. That part of me is done. We're not looking for love." Ayana responded, matching his tone. "We're looking for survival. You need help with this ranch. We can see it in the fences that need mending, the garden gone to seed the cattle that look like they haven't been properly tended in months. We need protection and a place to belong. It's business, Mr. Kane. The oldest business there is survival." But Suki was looking at him differently, her gaze holding something that wasn't quite business, wasn't quite survival. When she'd called him husband at the Henderson Ranch, there had been something else in her voice. Something that spoke of possibilities beyond mere arrangement. Samuel stood, walked to the window, looked out at his land. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of red and gold that reminded him of Elizabeth's hair. He could send them away, keep his solitude, his ghosts, his carefully maintained emptiness. Or he could open the door to something uncertain, complicated, potentially dangerous. "If you stay," he said without turning around, "you work. Everyone pulls their weight. No special treatment, no complaints about the harsh conditions. This ranch barely keeps me alive. Keeping 5 alive will take everything we've got and then some." "We're not afraid of work," Ayanna said. "And the town won't accept it," Samuel continued. 4 Apache women living with a white man. They already whisper about me. This will turn whispers into shouts. We're not afraid of their words," Kaya added, though her hand moved instinctively to the scar on her collarbone. Samuel turned back to face them. 4 women who'd lost everything but refused to break. 4 survivors who'd chosen him of all people as their last hope. He thought of Elizabeth, wondered what she would say. Probably laugh at the absurdity of it. Probably tell him that an empty house was just a tomb with better ventilation. "There's a bunkhouse out back," he said finally. "Needs cleaning, needs repairs, but it's got 4 beds and a stove. You can stay there while we figure this out. Tomorrow we start work at dawn. Everyone earns their keep." Suki stood, moved toward him with that liquid grace that seemed to characterize everything she did. "Thank you, husband," she said, and before he could correct her, she added, "That's what you'll be to the town, whether you speak it or not. Better to claim it than let them name it something worse." As the women filed out to inspect the bunkhouse, Samuel stood alone in his kitchen, wondering what he'd just agreed to. Outside, he could hear their voices speaking in Apache, planning, organizing, already making themselves part of this place. The frontier had taken everything from all of them. Maybe it owed them this a chance to build something from the ashes of their losses. It wouldn't be conventional, wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be what any of them had planned for their lives. But then again, Samuel thought as he watched them through the window, the frontier had never been about plans. It had always been about survival, about taking what life threw at you and making something from it, even if that something bore no resemblance to what you dreamed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, for the first time in 5 years, his ranch held more than just him and his ghosts. Whether that was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. The nightmares came for Samuel. That first night, the women stayed as if their presence had stirred up sediment that had settled in the dark corners of his mind. He woke, gasping sheets, soaked with sweat, Elizabeth's name dying on his lips. In the dream, she'd been calling for him from the bedroom while he was out fixing the fence, her voice growing weaker with each cry until it faded into the wind, just like it had happened 5 years ago. He sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, listening to the sounds from the bunkhouse. Soft voices in Apache, the creak of old boards adjusting to new weight, someone, probably Ayanna, tending to the stove. Living sounds. It had been so long since his ranch had held living sounds after dark. The memory crashed over him like a flash flood. Elizabeth, 8 months pregnant, her face flushed with fever that had come on sudden as a thunderstorm. Him riding hard to town for the doctor, finding the man drunk at the saloon, practically dragging him back. By the time they'd arrived, Elizabeth was delirious, calling for her mother, who'd been dead 10 years, calling for the baby to stop hurting her, calling for Samuel to make it stop. "There's nothing I can do." The doctor had slurred, whiskey still thick on his breath. "The fever's got her, and the baby's turned wrong. Sometimes the frontier takes what it wants." Samuel had held her hand through 16 hours of agony, watched the light fade from her green eyes, felt her fingers go slack in his. The baby, a son, had never drawn breath. Samuel had wrapped him in the quilt Elizabeth had been making, placed him in her arms, and buried them together on the hill overlooking the valley. He'd carved their marker himself, Elizabeth and James Kane, together forever. He hadn't spoken of it to anyone since. The town knew, of course, news traveled fast in perdition, but they'd learned quick that Samuel Kane wasn't a man who welcomed sympathy or scrutiny. He'd become the ghost of the valley, the widower who sold cattle and bought supplies and spoke to no one unless necessity demanded it. Standing now, Samuel walked to the kitchen, struck a match for the lantern. Through the window, he could see a faint glow from the bunkhouse. One of them was awake too, wrestling with her own ghosts. He wondered whose story hurt the worst in the dark hours before dawn. The next morning, over coffee and cornbread, the women's histories spilled out in pieces like water finding cracks in a dam. Ayanna spoke first, her voice steady but distant, as if she was telling someone else's story. My husband, Joseph Crowfeather, was educated at the Carlisle School. They cut his hair, beat him for speaking. Apache made him forget half of who he was. But he came back to the reservation anyway, tried to bridge both worlds. He said understanding the white man's ways would help our people survive. She paused, staring into her coffee. The cholera didn't care about his education. 3 days of fever and flux, and all his English words couldn't save him. I tried every medicine I knew, sat with him while he raved in both languages, neither one offering comfort. She pulled something from her dress pocket, a small leather pouch decorated with beadwork. This was his. Carried it through Carlisle, through everything. Still smells like the sage his grandmother blessed it with. I should bury it with him, but... She trailed off, tucking it away again. Some things you can't let go, even when holding them cuts you. Kaya's story came harder, pulled out in sharp fragments between bites of food she barely tasted. My husband was named Thomas Farwalker. Stupid name the agency gave him, but he wore it like armor. Said if he acted civilized enough, they'd leave us alone. Her laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. He was bringing medicine to a sick child when the settler accused him of stealing horses. Thomas put his hands up, tried to explain in his best English. The man shot him anyway, said he felt threatened. She unconsciously touched her scar. This came from trying to stop them taking his body. They wanted to burn it, said Apache corpses spread disease. I fought until a soldier knocked me down with his saber. When I woke up, Thomas was already in the ground, buried without ceremony in the potter's field. No prayers, no ritual, just dirt over a good man who'd tried so hard to be what they wanted. Neela's grief was quieter, woven through with guilt that seemed to eat at her from inside. Peter learned blacksmithing from the missionaries. He was good at it, patient with the metal patient with the horses. The horse that killed him. She stopped, swallowed hard. It was scared hurt. Someone had beaten it near to death, brought it to Peter to shoe so they could sell it. Peter was trying to calm it, speaking soft like he always did. But pain makes everything wild. She looked at her hands, traced a finger along calluses that told their own story. I was bringing him lunch, saw the horse rear, saw the hoof connect with his skull. The sound, she shuddered, like a melon dropping. He looked at me once before he fell, and there was such surprise in his eyes, like he couldn't believe this was how it would end after surviving everything else. Suki's story came last, and there was something different in her telling something that made Samuel's skin prickle with unease. My husband was called Robert by the whites, but his real name was Rising Hawk. He was young, angry, thought he could outsmart everyone the agency, the settlers, even other Apache. He was running stolen horses back to Mexico, selling them to whoever paid best. She met Samuel's eyes directly, no shame in her gaze. I knew what he was doing, helped him sometimes keeping watch, carrying messages. The rustlers who killed him, they were his partners once. Decided they didn't need an Apache taking a cut anymore. Her voice dropped. I heard everything from the root cellar, every word, every blow, every breath getting weaker. They laughed while he died. Said it was like putting down a rabid dog. She leaned forward slightly. But here's what they didn't know. I saw their faces through the cellar slats. Know their names. Tommy Morrison, Jake Sullivan, Carl Hendricks. They drink at the Silver Dollar every Saturday night. Sometimes I go to town just to watch them to remind myself that some debts haven't been paid yet. The room fell silent after that, heavy with the weight of their losses. Samuel understood now why they'd found each other, why they'd come to him. They were all walking wounded, carrying deaths that weren't just about losing loved ones, but about losing their place in the world. The reservation didn't want them, the town saw them as less than human, and every day they survived was a small rebellion against a world that would prefer they didn't. "I know about loss," Samuel said, finally surprising himself with the words. "My wife Elizabeth died in childbirth 5 years ago. The baby too. Fever took her, and there wasn't nothing I could do but watch." He stood, walked to the shelf where Elizabeth's china teacup still sat, the one she'd brought from St. Louis. "She was everything soft in my life, everything that made this place more than just dirt and sweat. When she died, I figured I might as well be dead too. Just kept going through the motions, waiting for something to finish the job." He turned back to them. "I'm not comparing pain. Don't believe in that. But I know what it's like to have the world take everything that matters and leave you standing there wondering why you're still breathing." Ayanna nodded slowly. "The breathing is the hardest part. People think it's the dying that's cruel, but it's the living after. Every sunrise feels like betrayal. Every meal you eat that they can't share," Neela added softly. "Every smile that catches you by surprise," Kaya said, her voice rough. "Like you're forgetting them." "But we don't forget," Suki said, and there was something fierce in her tone. "We carry them. In our skin, our bones, our blood. They're the ghosts that push us forward when stopping would be easier." Samuel looked at these 4 women survivors of different tragedies, but united in their refusal to surrender. He thought about Elizabeth, wondered what she'd make of this strange gathering in their kitchen. Probably she'd laugh that soft laugh of hers, the one that sounded like wind chimes, and say something about how broken people sometimes make the strongest walls when they lean against each other. "There's something else," Suki said suddenly, her voice taking on an odd quality. "The dream I had before we found you. It wasn't just about a man with winter eyes. There was a woman, too, standing behind you. Red hair like sunset, green eyes like spring grass. She was smiling, pointing at us, nodding, like she was saying yes." Samuel's blood went cold. He'd never told anyone about Elizabeth's appearance, never described her to a soul since her death. "What else?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She held a baby." Suki continued, her own voice dropping to match his. "Wrapped in a quilt with blue birds on it. She kissed his head, then looked at me and said, 'Take care of him. He's forgotten how to live.'" The teacup slipped from Samuel's numb fingers, shattering on the floor. The quilt Elizabeth had been making had blue birds on it. She'd been stitching them the day the fever came, said they reminded her of happiness, of freedom, of songs in the morning. The women stood to help clean the broken china, but Samuel waved them off, kneeling to gather the pieces himself. His hands shook as he picked up each fragment, seeing in them the reflection of everything broken in his life. "I don't believe in signs," he said roughly, not looking at any of them. "Don't believe in dreams or ghosts or any of that." "You don't have to believe," Ayanna said gently. "Sometimes the truth exists, whether we believe it or not." As Samuel swept up the last of the shattered cup, he felt something shift inside him, like ice beginning to crack on a frozen river. These women had brought more than their own grief to his ranch. They'd brought the possibility that grief might not be the end of the story, that broken things might find new shapes, even if they could never be what they were before. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny spirits. And, for just a moment, Samuel could swear he smelled roses, Elizabeth's favorite, though no roses had grown on his ranch since the day she died. The morning after Suki's revelation about her dream, Samuel found himself unable to look at the women the same way. He'd spent the dawn hours repairing the fence line, throwing himself into physical labor to avoid thinking about blue birds and red hair and messages from beyond the grave. But when he returned to find the 4 women working in seamless coordination, Ayanna teaching Neela to identify medicinal plants, Kaya skinning a rabbit she'd trapped Suki, mending his torn work shirts. He couldn't deny that something had shifted in the air around his ranch. It was Kaya who suggested they ride to the old Apache sacred grounds 15 miles north, where the reservation boundary met the canyon lands. "If we're going to stay," she said, not quite meeting his eyes, "we should ask permission from the spirits of this place. And maybe they'll tell us if this arrangement is meant to be." Samuel wanted to refuse. He didn't believe in spirits or sacred grounds or any of that. But something in Ayanna's expression, a mixture of hope and resignation, made him saddle the horses. They rode out as the sun climbed toward noon, the women sharing 2 horses, while Samuel rode alone. The trail wound through sagebrush and juniper, past towering red rocks that looked like frozen flames against the endless blue sky. Nobody spoke much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of people who understood that some moments were too fragile for words. The sacred grounds were nothing special to look at a circle of weathered stones around a flat clearing, a spring bubbling up from the rocks, a few ancient petroglyphs carved into the canyon wall. But when they dismounted, Samuel felt something shift in the air, like the pressure change before a storm. Ayanna began preparing a small fire, while Kaya gathered sage and sweetgrass. Neela filled a clay bowl from the spring, and Suki sat cross-legged on the ground, her eyes closed, swaying slightly as if hearing music no one else could detect. "You don't have to participate," Ayanna told Samuel, but her tone suggested she hoped he would. "What are we doing exactly?" he asked, surprised to find he genuinely wanted to know. "Asking," she said simply. "The Apache believe that when paths cross unexpectedly, there's usually a reason. We're asking the spirits of our ancestors and this land if our paths were meant to cross with yours." Samuel watched as they arranged themselves in a circle around the small fire. The smoke from the burning sage rose straight up in the still air, and the sound of the spring seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Despite himself, he found his skepticism wavering. "Sit," Suki said, opening her eyes to look directly at him. "The ceremony won't work if you're standing outside it." He sat feeling foolish, but somehow compelled. The women began to speak in Apache, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. He didn't understand the words, but he felt their weight, their purpose. This wasn't performance or superstition. This was genuine belief, genuine seeking. Then Suki switched to English, her voice taking on that strange, distant quality he'd heard when she'd described her dream. "The woman with sunset hair is here," she said, and Samuel's breath caught. "She stands behind you, her hand on your shoulder. She says the land has been too quiet, the house too empty. She says 4 sisters have come to fill the silence." "That's not," Samuel started, but Kaya held up her hand. "Let her speak," she said quietly. "Whether you believe or not, let her speak." Suki continued, her eyes unfocused, looking at something beyond the physical world. "There will be tests. Men will come with guns and torches. The town will spit poison. But if you stand together, if you claim each other not in words, but in actions, something new will grow from the ashes of what was lost." She blinked, seemed to come back to herself, and looked around the circle with confusion. What did I say?" But before anyone could answer, the sound of horses echoed through the canyon. A lot of horses. Samuel was on his feet instantly, his hand going to his rifle, but Ayanna touched his arm. "Wait," she said. "Look." Coming down the trail were 6 riders, but not the kind Samuel expected. These were Apache men, reservation Indians by their dress, but there was something formal about their approach, something ceremonial. The lead rider, an elderly man with silver hair braided with feathers, raised his hand in greeting. "Ayanna," he said in English. "We heard you had found refuge." She stood, and Samuel noticed how her spine straightened, how authority settled over her like a cloak. "Uncle," she said, and there was both warmth and wariness in her voice. I didn't expect to see you here." The old man dismounted, his movements careful but dignified. The other riders remained mounted, watching. The reservation agent told us 4 widows had left. Said they'd probably end up in the brothels or dead in the desert. His eyes moved to Samuel, assessing. "But here I find you with this man, Samuel Kane. Yes, the one who scouts fair and trades honest." Samuel nodded, unsure where this was going. The old man walked closer, studied each of the women, then looked back at Samuel. "In the old days," he said, "when a woman lost her husband, the tribe would arrange a new marriage quickly, for protection, for survival, for the continuation of our people. But these are not the old days, and the reservation has no place for women without men to speak for them." He pulled something from his belt, a decorated pouch similar to the one Ayanna carried. This belonged to Joseph Crow, Feather Ayanna's husband. And this, he pulled out another to Thomas Farwalker, this to Peter Ironhand, and this to Rising Hawk. 4 pouches, 4 dead men's possessions. By tradition, the old man continued, these should pass to the men's brothers or fathers, but their families are dead or scattered. So I bring them to you, Samuel Kane, because if these women are under your protection, you become responsible for their honor, their safety, their future. Samuel looked at the pouches, understanding the weight of what was being offered. This wasn't just about giving the women shelter. This was about accepting them into his life in a way that transcended simple charity. "I'm not Apache," he said carefully. "I don't know your ways." "You know enough," the old man replied. "You know that leaving them to the mercy of the town would be death. You know that sending them back to the reservation would be casting them out to starve. And you know," his eyes seemed to pierce straight through Samuel, "what it is to lose everything and still keep breathing." Samuel looked at each of the women. Ayanna watched him with that steady gaze that revealed nothing and everything. Kaya's jaw was set proud and defiant, daring him to refuse. Neela had her hands clasped, hope and fear warring in her expression. And Suki. Suki was smiling slightly as if she already knew what he would say. "If I take these," Samuel said, hefting the pouches, "what does it mean?" "Exactly. It means they are your responsibility," the old man said. "Your family if you choose to see it that way. The reservation will recognize your claim, and no Apache man can take them against their will. But it also means their shame becomes your shame, their honor your honor. The white town will not understand or accept it. You will be marked as surely as they are." Samuel thought about his empty house, his silent meals, his bed where he reached for a woman who was no longer there. He thought about the broken teacup, the smell of roses that couldn't exist, the dream of Elizabeth pointing at these women and saying yes. "I accept," he said, and took the pouches. The old man smiled, the first real emotion he'd shown. "Then it is done." He turned to the women and spoke in Apache. They responded in unison, words that sounded like a vow or a prayer. "What did they say?" Samuel asked. "They acknowledged you as their protector," Ayanna translated, "and they promised to bring honor to your house." The old man remounted his horse. "There is one more thing," he said, looking down at Samuel. "The one who sees," he indicated Suki. "Her gift is real. Listen when she speaks of dreams. The spirits have marked her as a bridge between worlds, and bridges should not be ignored." As the Apache riders disappeared back into the canyon, Samuel stood holding 4 dead men's possessions, surrounded by 4 living women who had just become his responsibility in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Now what?" he asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. "Now," Ayanna said, "we go home, all of us, together." The ride back to the ranch was different. The women rode closer to him, and their conversation flowed easier, mixing English and Apache practical plans and occasional laughter. Suki rode beside him for a while, and when their knees bumped, neither pulled away. "You didn't have to accept," she said quietly. The pouches, the responsibility. You could have refused. Could I? Samuel asked. Feels like this was decided before any of us had a say in it. She was quiet for a moment, then said, in my dream, the one I haven't told completely, your wife didn't just point at us. She pointed at you too, and she was crying, but they were happy tears. She said, finally he's ready to live again. Samuel's throat tightened. I don't know if I believe in dreams. You don't have to, Suki replied, echoing Ayana's earlier words. Some things happen whether we believe in them or not, like the sun rising, like the seasons changing, like hearts learning to beat again after they've been broken. As they crested the ridge above his ranch, Samuel saw his property spread out below the late afternoon sun, turning everything golden. But it looked different now, not empty but waiting, not abandoned but ready. The bunkhouse where the women stayed was already showing signs of life laundry on a line. He hadn't noticed them stringing a small garden plot, marked out beside it, smoke rising from the chimney. Home, Neela said softly, and Samuel realized with a start that she was right. Somewhere between yesterday and today, between his isolated grief and this strange ceremony in the canyon, his ranch had become home to more than just him and his ghosts. That night, they all ate together in the main house for the first time. The conversation was easier stories flowing with the food. Kaya told a funny story about trying to teach Thomas to hunt and him accidentally catching his own boot in a snare. Neela sang a soft song in Apache while she cleared the dishes. Ayana showed Samuel how to prepare a poultice for his horse's scraped leg. And Suki sat beside him on the porch afterward, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Do you see her anymore? She asked. Your wife in dreams. Samuel considered lying, but found he couldn't. Sometimes. Less than before. It used to be every night, but now. He paused, searching for words. Now it's like she's letting go. Or letting me go. Maybe, Suki said, moving slightly closer so their shoulders touched. She brought us together so she could rest. Maybe she knew you needed something to live for besides memory. He wanted to protest to say that 4 Apache women couldn't replace his Elizabeth, that this arrangement was purely practical. But as he sat there with Suki warm beside him and the sounds of the other women preparing for bed drifting from inside, he realized that wasn't what this was about. It wasn't about replacement. It was about continuation. It was about life insisting on itself, even when death seemed like the only truth that mattered. Tell me more about your dreams, he said finally. All of them, even the ones that don't make sense. So she did, her voice soft in the darkness, weaving stories of visions and possibilities of spirits and connections of paths that crossed not by accident, but by design. And Samuel listened, feeling something inside him that had been frozen for 5 years, beginning finally to thaw. The pouch containing Rising Hawk's possessions sat on the table inside, and Samuel found himself thinking it wasn't just the dead man's belongings he'd accepted. It was the possibility of a future that looked nothing like the past he'd been clinging to. It was the chance that 4 broken people and 1 broken man might make something whole, or at least whole enough to face whatever came next. Because something was coming. He could feel it in the air, see it in the way the town folk had looked at them when they'd passed through, sense it in the weight of the pouches he now carried. The old Apache man had been right. He was marked now, claimed by these women as surely as he had claimed them. And for the first time in 5 years, that didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the ceremony at the sacred grounds, and the rhythm of life at the ranch had settled into something that felt almost natural. The women had moved from the bunkhouse into the main house, a decision that happened gradually without formal discussion, as the cold nights made the separate arrangement impractical. Samuel had given up his bedroom to Ayana and Neela, while Kaya took the small room that had once been meant for a nursery. Suki slept on a cot in the main room, though more often than not, Samuel would find her sitting by the dying fire when he woke before dawn, as if she'd been keeping watch over all of them. It was on such a morning, the sky still dark with just a hint of purple on the eastern horizon, that everything changed. Samuel had risen to check on a sick calf, pulling on his boots quietly to avoid waking the others. But Suki was there, as always, a cup of coffee already waiting for him on the table. "You don't sleep," he said, not for the first time. "I dream better awake," she replied, that cryptic smile playing at her lips. "Besides, someone needs to watch for what's coming." And what's coming? She stood, moved closer to him than she'd ever dared before. "A choice," she said. "Today you make a choice that changes everything." Before he could ask what she meant, the sound of horses approaching fast broke the pre-dawn quiet. Not one or two, but many. Samuel grabbed his rifle, and within seconds the women were all awake, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to go from sleep to survival in heartbeats. Through the window, Samuel could see them 8 riders' torches blazing despite the approaching dawn. At their head rode Mayor Garrett himself, his round face red with righteous anger, followed by the sheriff, the bank president, and several of the town's most prominent citizens. "Samuel Kane," the mayor shouted, "come out and face justice." Samuel stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, but not raised. The women flanked him, and he was struck by how naturally they fell into defensive positions. Kaya slightly behind and to his left, where she could cover the side approach. Ayanna to his right, with her hand on the knife at her belt. Neela and Suki behind them, all but ready to reload weapons or tend wounds. What justice would that be? "Mayor," Samuel asked, his voice carrying that dangerous calm that had served him in the war. "You're harboring Apache whores," the bank president, a thin man named Carlson, spat. "It's an affront to decency, to Christian values, to everything this town stands for." "They're under my protection," Samuel said simply. "That makes them family, not whores." The sheriff, a man Samuel had once considered reasonably fair, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Sam, be reasonable. The town council met last night. Either these women leave by noon, or we'll burn you out. All of you." "You'd murder women for the crime of being Apache." Ayanna stepped forward, her voice cutting like a blade. "Is that your Christian values?" "Shut your mouth, savage," Carlson snarled. "You have no right to speak to white men." The click of Samuel cocking his rifle was loud in the morning air. "She has every right. This is my land, my home, and these are my people. You want them, you go through me." "There are 8 of us, Kane," the mayor said. "You can't win this fight." "Maybe not," Kaya said, stepping into view with her own rifle, the one Samuel had given her just days before. "But we'll take enough of you with us that your widows will remember this day forever." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Samuel could see fingers twitching toward triggers, could feel the moment balanced on the edge of bloodshed. And then Suki did something unexpected. She walked forward past Samuel, past the aimed rifles, straight toward the mounted men. Several guns swung toward her, but she didn't flinch. "I know you," she said, looking directly at the sheriff. "Tom Morrison, your daughter has the wasting sickness. Gets weaker every day. The doctor from Denver said there's nothing to be done." The sheriff's face went pale. "How do you—" "I dream things," Suki said simply. "True things. And I dreamed of a cure. Apache medicine, old knowledge your doctors don't have. Ayanna knows the plants, knows the way. She could save your daughter." "Don't listen to her witchcraft," Carlson shouted, but the sheriff was staring at Suki with desperate hope. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ayanna stepped forward. "The wasting sickness consumption, you call it. I've seen it before. There's a treatment, difficult and long, but it works. Requires plants that only grow in the canyon lands, prepared in specific ways. I could teach your wife, help your daughter, but not if we're dead or driven away." The sheriff looked at the mayor, at Carlson, at the other men who'd come for blood and righteousness. Then he looked at his hands holding the reins, and Samuel saw the moment the man's resolve crumbled. "My Margaret's dying," he said quietly. 11 years old and fading like smoke, if there's even a chance. Tom, you can't seriously, the mayor started. I can and I am. The sheriff turned his horse. I'm done here. Anyone who wants to burn out Kane will have to go through me, too. You're choosing savages over your own kind. Carlson's voice was shrill with disbelief. The sheriff looked back, and there was something broken but determined in his eyes. I'm choosing my daughter over your hate. One by one, 3 other men followed the sheriff, leaving the mayor with only 3 supporters. The odds had shifted, and everyone knew it. But the mayor wasn't done. This isn't over, Kane. You can't just take in Apache women like they're stray cats. It ain't natural, ain't right. The town won't stand for it. Then I'll make it right. Samuel said the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. By law and by God. What are you saying? Samuel looked at each of the women, saw surprise in some faces, understanding in others. In Suki's eyes, he saw that knowing smile, as if this was exactly what she'd been expecting. I'm saying I'll marry them, legal and proper. Judge Hoffman can do the ceremony. Then they're not Apache women living in sin. They're my wives with all the legal protection that provides. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to stop breathing. You can't marry 4 women, Carlson finally sputtered. It's bigamy. Polygamy, Ayanna corrected quietly. And while it's not recognized by federal law, territorial law is flexible, especially with the judge's approval. Samuel remembered then that Ayanna could read, that she'd studied more than just healing plants. She'd studied survival in all its forms, including legal ones. Judge Hoffman would never... The mayor started. Judge Hoffman's son was saved by an Apache scout during the Carson campaign. Samuel interrupted. The judge has never forgotten that debt. I think he'll be... understanding. The mayor's face had gone from red to purple. This is insanity. You're talking about marrying 4 Apache women. I'm talking about protecting 4 human beings who've done nothing wrong except survive. Samuel shot back. Now get off my land before I forget my manners. The mayor wheeled his horse around violently. This isn't over, Kane. The whole territory will hear about this abomination. You'll be ruined. I was ruined 5 years ago, Samuel said quietly, but his voice carried. Everything since has been borrowed time. Might as well use it for something worthwhile. As the riders disappeared in a cloud of dust, Samuel lowered his rifle and found his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what he'd just proposed. The women gathered around him, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Kaya broke the silence. You don't have to do this. Marriage, even territorial marriage, it's permanent. So is death, Samuel replied, which is what waits for you without protection. But 4 wives. Neela's voice was soft, uncertain. People will say, people already say. Samuel cut her off gently. My reputation died with Elizabeth. Might as well bury it proper and build something new on top. Ayanna studied him with those deep, knowing eyes. You understand what you're proposing. This isn't just paper protection. In Apache tradition, a man who takes a wife takes all of her past, present, future, her debts, her dreams, her demons. And times 4, Kaya added with dark humor. Samuel looked at each of them. Ayanna with her quiet strength and healing hands. Kaya with her fierce protection and warrior's heart. Neela with her gentleness and hidden steel. And Suki with her dreams and prophecies. And that smile that suggested she knew how this story ended before it had barely begun. I buried my heart 5 years ago, he said finally. Thought that was the end of feeling anything. But you 4, you've made me remember what it's like to have something worth protecting, worth fighting for, maybe even worth living for. Suki stepped close, took his hand. Her fingers were warm, calloused from work, but gentle in their touch. The choice, she said softly. This was the choice I saw. And you chose us. We choose you too, Ayanna said, and the others nodded. Then we'd better ride to town, Samuel said, though his voice was rough with emotion. Judge Hoffman holds court on Tuesdays. If we're doing this, might as well do it before the mayor rallies more support." As they prepared for the ride to town, Samuel caught sight of his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was still weathered, still scarred, but there was something different in his eyes. Not happiness exactly, that would take time, but purpose, direction. Elizabeth had been his past, perfect and untouchable in memory. These 4 women were his present, complicated and dangerous and real, and somehow, in choosing to protect them, he'd chosen to rejoin the living. The sun was fully up now, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. As they mounted their horses, Suki riding with him, her arms around his waist, Samuel felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders, not crushing him, but grounding him. "No turning back now," Kaya said, checking her rifle one more time. "There never was," Samuel replied, spurring his horse forward. "From the moment you called me husband at the Henderson place, this was always where we were headed." The road to town stretched before them, dusty and uncertain. But for the first time in 5 years, Samuel Kane wasn't riding alone, and that he realized made all the difference. The judge would either approve their unusual union, or they'd have to leave the territory entirely. But either way, they'd face it together. 4 Apache widows and 1 white widower, bound by lost survival and the strange alchemy that transforms strangers into family. As they rode, Suki began to sing softly in Apache, a song that sounded like blessing and battle cry combined. One by one, the other women joined in their voices, harmonizing in the morning air. Samuel didn't understand the words, but he felt their power, their promise. Whatever came next, whether acceptance or exile, peace or violence, they would meet it as one. Judge Hoffman's courthouse stood at the center of perdition like a weathered monument to frontier justice. Built from limestone hauled from the quarry 40 miles north, it was one of the few structures in town that suggested permanence, that promised something might last longer than the next Indian raid or mining boom. Samuel stood before the judge's desk with the 4 women arranged beside him, aware of every eye in the packed courtroom. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Samuel Kane, the hermit widower, was attempting to marry 4 Apache women at once. Half the town had crowded in to witness what they assumed would be either a spectacle or a massacre of propriety. Judge Hoffman, 70 years old, with a beard white as fresh snow and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be surprised by anything, looked over his spectacles at the assembled group. "Mr. Kane," he said, his voice dry as August dust, "you realize what you're asking me to do. I'm asking you to recognize a union that protects these women under the law." Samuel replied steadily. "They've lost their husbands, been rejected by both the reservation and the town. Without legal protection, they're vulnerable to anyone who wants to harm them. And you believe marriage to all 4 is the solution?" Before Samuel could answer, Ayanna stepped forward. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded. "In Apache tradition," she said, her voice clear and strong, "it's not uncommon for a man to take multiple wives, especially widows who need protection. It ensures survival of the family unit, the preservation of our culture, and the safety of women who would otherwise be cast out. This arrangement honors both our traditions and provides legal standing in your world. Furthermore," she continued, pulling out a piece of paper from her dress, "I've researched territorial law. While polygamy is not recognized federally, the territorial statutes are silent on the matter. There's no explicit prohibition, especially in cases involving indigenous customs and the protection of vulnerable persons." The judge took the paper, scanned it with obvious surprise. "You can read law." "I can read many things, Your Honor. Survival requires it." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mayor Garrett stood up from his seat. "This is blasphemy, Judge. You can't seriously consider—" "Mayor Garrett, you're out of order," the judge said mildly. "Sit down, or I'll have you removed." The mayor sat, his face flushed with fury. Judge Hoffman looked at each of the women in turn. And you all consent to this arrangement freely without coercion." Kaya stepped forward. "More freely than anything else in our lives, Your Honor." Neela nodded, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Kane offers us dignity and protection. That's more than anyone else has." Suki moved closer to Samuel, her hand finding his. "In my dreams, this was always meant to be. 4 broken souls and 1 broken man making something whole." The judge studied them for a long moment, then looked at Samuel. "And you, Mr. Kane, you understand that this decision will mark you permanently. The town, the territory, perhaps the whole nation will condemn you." Samuel thought of Elizabeth's grave, of 5 years of silence, of the empty chair across from him at every meal. Then he looked at these 4 women who'd brought life back to his dead ranch, who'd made him remember what it felt like to have something to protect. "Judge," he said, "I've been condemned since the day I buried my wife and son. At least now I'll be condemned for something worthwhile." The judge leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard. The courtroom held its breath. "Tom Morrison," the judge called suddenly. The sheriff stood up from the back of the room. "Your daughter, how is she?" The sheriff's voice was thick with emotion. "Dying, Your Honor. A little more each day. And Mrs. Ayanna here claims she can help. She knows things, Judge, about the sickness. Things our doctor doesn't." The judge nodded slowly. 20 years ago, an Apache scout saved my son's life during the Carson campaign, pulled him from under a dead horse while bullets flew overhead. I've never forgotten that debt." He looked at the assembled crowd. "Perhaps it's time we all remembered that humanity doesn't wear only one face." He stood, his black robes rustling. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I hereby recognize the union between Samuel Kane and these 4 women, Ayanna, Kaya, Neela, and Suki. May God have mercy on all your souls, because this town surely won't." He banged his gavel once sharp as a gunshot. The courtroom erupted. Some shouted condemnations, others sat in stunned silence. But Samuel barely heard any of it. He was looking at the 4 women who were now legally and officially his wives. The absurdity of it should have terrified him. Instead, he felt something like peace. They left the courthouse through a gauntlet of stares and whispers. Someone spat at Kaya's feet. She stepped over it without breaking stride. A woman pulled her children close, as if Apache might be contagious. Neela lowered her eyes, but kept walking. Men who'd traded with Samuel for years turned their backs. Ayanna held her head high, dignity radiating from every step. But it was Suki who surprised him. She walked with her arm through his, publicly claiming him as surely as he'd claimed them. When Mrs. Carlson, the bank president's wife, hissed, shameful, as they passed, Suki smiled at her with such radiant confidence that the woman actually stepped back. The ride home was quiet, each of them processing what had just happened. But as they crested the ridge above the ranch, Ayanna suddenly laughed, a sound like water breaking through a dam. "What?" Samuel asked. "I just realized," she said, "we're probably the most married women in the entire territory. Most women are lucky to have 1 wedding. We just had 4. The absurdity of it hit them all at once, and soon they were all laughing, even Kaya, the sound echoing across the desert like a declaration. That evening, they set about the practical business of making the arrangement work. The main house had 3 rooms: Samuel's bedroom, the main room with kitchen, and the small room that would have been a nursery. It wasn't enough space for 5 adults to live separately, and none of them pretended otherwise. "We need to build," Kaya said practically. "Add rooms, expand the kitchen, maybe a 2nd floor." With what money?" Samuel asked, though he was already calculating what he could sell. "We'll figure it out," Ayanna said. "But first, we need to establish how this works. The sleeping arrangements." An awkward silence fell. This was the part none of them had fully thought through. The marriage might be legal protection, but they were still 5 strangers trying to navigate an impossible situation. It was Suki who spoke first. In Apache tradition, each wife would have her own space within the home, her own area for her belongings, her work. But the husband, she paused, color rising in her cheeks. The husband visits each wife as appropriate. We're not following Apache tradition completely, Samuel said quickly. This marriage is for protection, not for... He trailed off, unsure how to finish. Not for love, Neela asked quietly. Not for comfort, not for building a real family. The question hung in the air like smoke. What do you want this to be? Ayanna asked Samuel directly. A legal fiction we maintain for survival or something more? Samuel looked at each of them. In the 3 weeks they'd been at the ranch, they'd already become essential to his daily rhythm. Ayanna's wisdom and steady presence, Kaya's fierce protection and unexpected humor, Neela's quiet kindness and the way she hummed while she worked, and Suki, who looked at him like he was worth saving. I don't know, he admitted. I know I want you safe. I know the ranch feels alive again with you here, but I also know I'm not whole. Haven't been for 5 years. I don't know what I have to offer beyond protection. Then we start there, Ayanna said decisively. Protection and partnership. The rest we figure out as we go. They spent the next weeks establishing their new life. The sleeping arrangements sorted themselves naturally. Ayanna and Neela shared Samuel's former bedroom. Kaya took the would-be nursery after they cleared it of its painful memories, and Suki set up a space in the main room. Though she still spent most nights by the fire, keeping her strange vigil, Samuel built a lean-to addition for himself off the main house, giving everyone privacy while keeping close enough for protection. But more often than not, he found himself in the main room in the evenings, all of them gathered around the fire, sharing the day's work and tomorrow's plans. The ranch began to transform. Ayanna started a medicine garden cultivating plants she'd gathered from the canyon lands. She also began treating the sheriff's daughter, and word of her healing skills spread despite the town's prejudice. People would ride out after dark seeking help for ailments the town doctor couldn't cure, leaving payment on the fence post rather than facing Samuel directly. Kaya turned her hunting skills into income, bringing in deer and elk that Samuel sold to the mining camps. She also started breaking horses with a technique that combined Apache methods with Samuel's experience, creating mounts that were both spirited and reliable. Neela transformed the house itself, bringing order and beauty to what had been purely functional. She convinced Samuel to trade for cloth and made curtains, tablecloths, and new shirts for all of them. Under her touch, the harsh frontier dwelling became something approaching a home. And Suki was everywhere and nowhere, helping with everything but belonging to no single task. She had a gift for knowing when each person needed help, appearing at Kaya's side when a horse proved difficult, sitting with Neela when the loneliness hit, mixing herbs with Ayanna when the work grew complex. But it was her time with Samuel that began to shift something fundamental in the household. She would ride with him to check the fences, and her presence made the solitary work feel less like exile. She would sit beside him while he repaired her commentary, making him laugh for the first time in years. And sometimes late at night, when the others slept, she would find him on the porch, and they would talk about dreams and losses and the strange paths that had brought them together. One night, about a month after the wedding, Samuel found himself unable to sleep. He stepped onto the porch to find all 4 women already there, wrapped in blankets, watching a meteor shower paint streams of light across the desert sky. Couldn't sleep either, Ayanna asked. The house was too quiet, he admitted, which made them all laugh since the house was fuller and noisier than it had been in years. You mean you were alone? Suki said softly, and the truth of it hung between them all. We're all alone, Kaya said, uncharacteristically philosophical. Even together, we're alone with our ghosts. But maybe, Neela suggested, being alone together is better than being alone apart. Samuel sat down among them, and Suki immediately leaned against his shoulder. After a moment's hesitation, Neela took his hand. Ayanna and Kaya moved closer, and suddenly they were all connected, watching the stars fall like promises across the night sky. "The town came by today," Ayanna said quietly, "while you were at the North Pasture. 5 men, including Carlson. They said we have 1 month to leave, or they'll burn us out." Samuel's body tensed, but Suki's hand on his arm kept him from standing. "We're not leaving," he said firmly. "No," Kaya agreed. "We're not. But we need to be ready for what's coming." "What's coming?" Suki said in that strange, distant voice that meant she was seeing beyond the present. "Will test us all, but we'll survive it. Different than before, changed, but alive." "All of us?" Samuel asked. Suki was quiet for a long moment. "Most of us," she said finally, and wouldn't elaborate no matter how they pressed. They stayed on the porch until dawn, held together by shared warmth and shared fear, and something else, something that might have been the beginning of love, though none of them were ready to name it yet. As the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and possibility, Samuel looked at his 4 wives and felt the strangest sensation. It was as if Elizabeth was there too, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a blessing, as if she was saying, "Yes, this is right. This is what living looks like." The house that had been built for 2, that had sheltered 1 for too long, now held 5. And somehow, impossibly, it didn't feel crowded. It felt like home. The first sign of real trouble came 6 weeks after the marriage on a Sunday morning when the air hung still and heavy with the promise of storm. Samuel had ridden to the North Pasture to check on the cattle, leaving the women to their routine, Ayanna tending the sheriff's daughter who'd shown remarkable improvement, Kaya preparing hides from yesterday's hunt, Neela baking bread that filled the house with warmth, and Suki working in the garden that had begun to flourish, despite the harsh soil. It was Suki who saw them first, a delegation of women from town, 5 of them in their Sunday best, approaching in a wagon driven by Mrs. Garrett, the mayor's wife. Her face was set in lines of righteous determination that meant nothing good. "We have company," Suki called out, and the others gathered quickly, understanding that women visiting without their husbands meant something specific, either charity or condemnation, and they all knew which was more likely. The wagon stopped just outside the fence, as if crossing onto the property might contaminate them. Mrs. Garrett stood, her black dress severe. Despite the growing heat, her companions flanking her like soldiers in petticoats. "We've come to speak with you," she announced, addressing all 4 women but looking at none of them directly. "About your situation." Ayanna stepped forward, dignity radiating from every line of her body. "Then speak." Mrs. Garrett's mouth pursed like she'd tasted something sour. "What you're doing here, this arrangement, it's an abomination before God and man. You're corrupting a grieving man, taking advantage of his loneliness, practicing your heathen ways." "Is that what we're doing?" Kaya interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Or are we surviving in a world that would rather see us dead?" Mrs. Carlson, the bank president's wife, stepped forward. "There are proper ways to survive. The mission takes in Indian women, teaches them civilized skills. Teaches us to be servants, you mean?" Neela said quietly, but with steel underneath. "I spent 3 years at the mission. They taught me to read just enough to follow recipes, write just enough to take orders, and pray just enough to forget who I was." "Better than living in sin," Mrs. Garrett shot back. "We're legally married," Ayanna reminded them. Judge Hoffman performed the ceremony himself. "A ceremony that makes a mockery of the sacred institution of marriage." Mrs. Garrett's voice rose. "1 man, 4 wives. It's barbaric." Suki laughed, sudden and bright. "Barbaric, like burning out families who don't conform, like spitting at women for the crime of being Apache, like letting children die because their mother can't afford the doctor's fees." The reference to medical care struck home. Everyone knew Ayanna had been treating not just the sheriff's daughter, but others who came secretly seeking help. The town doctor charged rates that broke families. Ayanna asked only for what people could spare. Mrs. Morrison, the sheriff's wife, shifted uncomfortably. She'd been silent until now, and when she spoke, her voice was conflicted. "My Margaret is walking again. First time in months. The medicine Ayanna makes is working." "Then you're a traitor too," Mrs. Garrett snapped, choosing savage remedies over Christian prayer. "I've prayed every day for 2 years," Mrs. Morrison replied, tears starting down her cheeks. "God sent help. I don't care what color it comes in." The delegation was fracturing, and Mrs. Garrett knew it. She gathered her composure, fixing each of the Apache women with a stare meant to wither. "We're giving you one chance," she said. "Leave tonight. We'll provide money for passage back to the reservation or wherever you choose to go. But if you stay, if you continue this affront to decency, we'll make sure you regret it." "Is that a threat?" Kaya's hand moved subtly toward the rifle leaning against the porch rail. "It's a promise," Mrs. Garrett replied. "We're good Christian women, but we won't stand by while our community is corrupted. We have sons to raise, daughters to protect. We won't let them grow up thinking this arrangement is acceptable." Before anyone could respond, the sound of horses approaching fast made everyone turn. Samuel was riding hard from the north, and he wasn't alone. Behind him rode 3 men cowboys from the Triple Bar Ranch, the massive operation that controlled most of the valley's water rights. Samuel dismounted in a fluid motion, positioning himself between the women and the wagon. "Mrs. Garrett," he said, touching his hat brim with mocking politeness, "to what do we owe the pleasure?" "We came to appeal to these women's sense of decency," she replied, though her confidence had wavered at the arrival of the cowboys. "Their decency." Samuel's voice went dangerously quiet. "These women who've worked from dawn to dusk, making this ranch productive, who've healed sick children the town doctor gave up on, who've asked for nothing but the right to exist. That decency." One of the cowboys, a man named Jake Turner, whom Samuel had served with in the war, spoke up. "Heard there might be trouble out this way, Sam. Thought you could use some backup." Mrs. Garrett's eyes widened. The Triple Bar Ranch supporting Samuel changed the dynamics considerably. "Mr. Turner, surely you don't approve of this situation?" Jake shrugged. "I approve of men keeping their word and protecting their family. Sam gave his word to protect these women. That's good enough for me." "And me," said another cowboy, Ben Hayes. "Besides Mrs. Kaya, there brought down a 12-point elk last week. Best venison we've had at the bunkhouse in years. Woman who can shoot like that deserves respect." The third cowboy, young Tommy Rodriguez, added with a grin, "And Miss Neela's bread is famous already. Cookie at the ranch offered to trade 2 horses for her sourdough starter recipe." The compliments were strategic, Samuel realized. The cowboys were making it clear that the Apache women had already integrated into the wider community, at least the working class part of it. Mrs. Garrett gathered her dignity like armor. "We'll see what the territorial governor has to say about this." "There are laws." "The marriage is legal," Samuel interrupted. "And unless the territorial legislature wants to start invalidating marriages performed by legitimate judges, it'll stand." The delegation retreated to their wagon, but Mrs. Garrett had one last shot. "You had a respectable wife once, Mr. Kane. Elizabeth was a lady. What would she think of you now sharing your home with 4—" She never finished the sentence. Samuel's expression had gone deadly cold, and even from 20 feet away, the menace was palpable. "Elizabeth," he said slowly, each word precise as a bullet, "believed in kindness, in helping those who needed it, in judging people by their actions, not their blood. She would have welcomed these women, helped them, defended them, because that's who she was. Don't you dare use her memory for your hatred." The wagon pulled away in tense silence, dust rising behind it like a flag of retreat. When they were gone, Samuel turned to face his wives and the cowboys. His hands were shaking not from fear, but from rage held barely in check. "Thank you," he said to Jake and the others. "Didn't expect backup." "Mr. Hobson sent us," Jake explained, referring to the Triple Bar's owner. "Said any man who'd stand up to the whole town for what's right deserved support. Plus," he grinned, "he wants to hire Mrs. Ayana to look at his prize stallion. Horse has been off his feed for weeks." This was significant. William Hobson was the richest man in 3 counties. His support could shift the entire dynamic. After the Cowboys left, promising to keep an ear out for trouble, the 5 of them gathered in the kitchen. The confrontation had shaken everyone, but it had also solidified something. "They won't stop," Ayana said pragmatically. "Mrs. Garrett has made this a crusade." "Let her," Kaya replied. "We've faced worse than angry white women." "Have we?" Neela asked quietly. "They have influence connections. They can make life impossible in ways that don't involve guns." Samuel had been quiet, but now he spoke. "The Triple Bar's support changes things. Hobson employs half the county. If he's backing us, others will think twice." He paused, looking at each of them. "But this is going to get worse before it gets better. If any of you want to leave—" "Stop," Suki interrupted. She moved to him, took his hands. "We're not leaving. This is our home now, our family." The word family hung in the air more real than it had been before. The external pressure was forcing them to define what they were to each other, and the definition was becoming clearer. That evening, a rider approached with a different purpose. Dr. Marcus Fielding, the town's only physician, stopped his buggy at the gate and called out politely for permission to approach. Samuel met him with cautious curiosity. The doctor had never been actively hostile, but he'd never been friendly either. "Mr. Kane," the doctor said, removing his hat. "I've come with a proposition." "Speak your piece." The doctor glanced toward the house where Ayana was visible in the doorway. "Mrs. Morrison has been telling everyone about her daughter's recovery. There are others, many others, who need help I can't provide. I've studied traditional medicine, but what Mrs. Ayana knows, it's beyond my training." He paused, visibly struggling with his pride. "I'd like to learn, to work with her, combine our knowledge." It was a stunning offer for a white doctor to publicly acknowledge an Apache woman's medical expertise was almost unheard of. Ayana stepped onto the porch. "You'd face the same ostracism we do." "Perhaps," the doctor admitted, "but I became a physician to heal people. If that means learning from unconventional sources, so be it." "And your fees?" Ayana asked shrewdly. "We could establish a sliding scale. Those who can pay support, those who can't." He met her eyes directly. "Equal partnership. Your name alongside mine on the practice." Samuel saw the calculation in Ayana's face. This could change everything, give them legitimacy, income, and protection that even Mrs. Garrett couldn't easily assault. "I'll consider it," Ayana said finally. "Come back in 3 days. Bring your most difficult case files." After the doctor left the mood, in the house was electric. Possibility hummed in the air like lightning before a storm. "A real medical practice," Neela breathed. "Imagine." "It's a risk," Kaya warned. "If it fails, we'll be even more exposed." "Everything's a risk," Samuel said. "But this could work. Ayana's skills, the doctor's credentials, Hobson's backing. It's a foundation." That night, they celebrated quietly, but genuinely. Neela made a special dinner with venison. Kaya had hunted vegetables from Suki's garden and bread that was indeed worthy of trading horses for. Ayana produced a bottle of mezcal she'd been saving, and even Kaya's stern features softened as they passed it around. As the evening deepened, Suki stood and began to dance. It was an Apache pattern dance telling a story with movement, loss, journey, discovery, hope. One by one, the others joined her, even Samuel, who moved awkwardly but earnestly through the steps they taught him. Later, when the fire had died to embers and the others had retired, Samuel found himself alone with Suki on the porch. She leaned against him, comfortable with the closeness that had developed between them. "You defended us today," she said. Elizabeth's memory. That cost you something. It gave me something too, he replied. Permission, maybe, to let her be the past without betraying her. Suki was quiet for a moment. In my dream last night, I saw children playing in the yard while we watched from this porch. Mixed blood, mixed heritage, but loved. Completely loved. Samuel's breath caught. Children meant. Well, it meant acknowledging that this marriage was more than legal protection. Whose children? He asked carefully. She smiled that mysterious smile. Does it matter? Family is family. Before he could respond, she kissed him. Not the desperate kiss of their early days, but something deeper, more certain. When they parted, she stood and walked toward the door, pausing to look back. The others know, she said simply. And they're not opposed. We've all lost so much, Samuel. Maybe it's time we started building instead of just surviving. She went inside, leaving him alone with the vast desert night and the weight of possibility. 4 wives, not just in law, but perhaps in truth. The complexity of it should have terrified him. Instead, he found himself imagining the children Suki had dreamed running through the yard, calling him father, in 2 languages, carrying forward all their varied heritage into a future none of them could fully imagine. From inside, he heard quiet laughter, the soft murmur of women's voices planning tomorrow's work, his wives, his family, his unexpected second chance at life. The town would continue to fight them. Mrs. Garrett would make good on her threats. There would be violence, he could feel it coming, like storm clouds on the horizon. But tonight, in this moment, they were winning. Not the war, perhaps, but this battle for legitimacy, for community, for the right to exist on their own terms. Samuel stood and walked inside to join his family. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. Tonight, they were together, and that was enough. The house that had once echoed with silence now hummed with life. Complex, difficult, dangerous life, but life nonetheless. And Samuel Kane, who'd thought his story ended in a grave on a hillside, was beginning to understand that some stories don't end at all. They just transform. The storm that had been building for months finally broke on a September evening when the desert heat still clung to the rocks like a fever. Samuel had been tracking signs all week, riders on the ridges who disappeared when spotted cattle found with their throats cut, water barrels poisoned with dead rats. Someone was trying to drive them out through a campaign of steady terror. It was Kaya who brought the final warning, riding hard from the southern boundary where she'd been hunting. Her horse was lathered with sweat, and her face carried the grim expression of someone who'd seen death approaching. "They're coming tonight," she said, dismounting in a single fluid motion. "At least 20 men. I saw them gathering at Skeleton Creek. They have torches, guns, and rope." The rope part made Samuel's blood run cold. This wasn't just about burning them out anymore. "How long?" he asked, already moving toward the house. 2 hours, maybe less. They were drinking, working up courage. Inside, the women gathered quickly. Ayana immediately began pulling medical supplies together, bandages, herbs, for pain tools, for removing bullets. She'd seen enough violence to know preparation meant survival. Neela's hand shook as she loaded the rifles, but her aim would be steady when it counted. Suki stood by the window, that distant look in her eyes that meant she was seeing beyond the present moment. "Some of us won't survive this," she said quietly. "I've seen it." Blood on the floor, a grave on the hill next to Elizabeth's. "Whose grave?" Samuel demanded. She shook her head. "The dreams don't show faces, only outcomes. But someone pays the price tonight." "Then we change the outcome," Kaya said fiercely. "Dreams aren't fate." "Sometimes they are," Suki replied, but she picked up a rifle anyway. Samuel's mind raced through their options. 20 men against 5 defenders, one of them inexperienced with weapons. The house was solid, but not fortified. They had ammunition, but not unlimited. And help, even if someone could ride for it, was hours away. "We could run," Neela suggested hesitantly. "Take what we can carry and no." Samuel's voice was granite. "We run now. We run forever. This is our home. We defend it." He began issuing orders with the crisp efficiency of someone who'd commanded men in battle. "Kaya, take the east windows. You're our best shot. Make them count. Ayana, west side, and prepare medical stations in the root cellar. Neela, you're loading rifles and watching the back door. Suki." He paused, looking at the youngest wife. "Stay with me. Your dreams might give us warning." They worked in focused silence, barricading doors, positioning furniture for cover, distributing ammunition. Samuel pulled up the loose floorboard where he kept his Army Colt .45 and spare cartridges, relics from a war he'd tried to forget, but whose lessons might save them now. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the desert blood red, Suki grabbed Samuel's arm. "They're splitting up, some coming from the front, others circling to the barn." "How do you—" he started, but the sound of horses cut him off. Many horses moving fast. "Positions," he barked. The first shots came without warning or demands for surrender. Windows shattered, showering them with glass. Neela cried out as a shard sliced her arm, but she kept loading rifles, blood streaming down to her wrist. Samuel returned fire through the broken window, his shots disciplined and effective. A man screamed and fell from his horse. Kaya's rifle cracked from the east side, and another rider went down. "The barn," Ayana shouted. "They're setting fire to the barn." The loss of the barn would be devastating their hay store's tools, the wagon, but Samuel couldn't spare anyone to save it. Orange light began flickering through the windows as smoke rose into the darkening sky. Then came Mayor Garrett's voice, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "Samuel Kane, send out those Apache whores and you can leave alive. This is your last chance." "Go to hell," Samuel roared back, punctuating his response with a shot that sent the mayor diving for cover. The attack intensified. Bullets tore through the walls, sending splinters flying. The smoke from the burning barn began drifting toward the house, making it hard to see and harder to breathe. Kaya was magnificent, picking off attackers with deadly precision despite the chaos. "That's 4 down," she counted grimly. "Maybe 5. But they were being overwhelmed. The attackers had better positions, more ammunition, and time on their side. The house was becoming a death trap. It was then that Suki stood up, ignoring Samuel's shout to get down. She walked to the door with an otherworldly calm. "What are you doing?" Samuel grabbed for her, but she slipped past. "Changing the dream," she said. "Trust me." She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, hands raised, but not in surrender. In the firelight from the burning barn, she looked like something out of legend, young, beautiful, and absolutely unafraid. "Tommy Morrison," she called out. "Jake Sullivan, Carl Hendricks." The firing slowed, confused. "I know you 3, she continued, her voice carrying across the yard. "You killed my first husband, shot him down like a dog while I hid in the root cellar." I heard every word, every laugh. Samuel realized what she was doing. The 3 men she'd named were wanted for rustling and murder in 3 territories. Their involvement here would destroy any claim to legal authority the mob had. "She's lying," someone shouted, but uncertainty had crept into the mob's energy. "Am I?" Suki stepped forward. "Should I describe how Tommy likes to cut ears off his victims? How Jake always says a prayer after killing like that makes it clean? How Carl wears that distinctive turquoise ring he took from a Mexican trader he murdered last spring?" More murmuring from the attackers. These were specific details, things that rang true. Then Sheriff Morrison's voice cut through the night. "Stand down, everyone stand down." The sheriff rode into the firelight with 10 deputies, all armed, all looking ready for war. But more importantly, William Hobson was with them, along with 15 triple-bar cowboys. "This ends now," Hobson declared, his authority backed by wealth and firepower. "Any man who fires another shot will be arrested or shot down. Your choice." The mob wavered. They'd come expecting easy victims, not a battle against the county's most powerful rancher. Mayor Garrett emerged from cover, his face red with rage and soot. "Hobson, you can't." "I can and I will," Hobson interrupted. "Kane and his wives have broken no laws, but burning property, attempted murder, those are hanging offenses. Sheriff, I believe you have some arrests to make." What happened next was chaos. Some of the mob tried to run, others surrendered. The three men Suki had named made a desperate break for the desert, but were run down by triple-bar cowboys who seemed to take particular pleasure in the chase. But in the confusion, one man, Carlson, the bank president, had circled around to the back of the house. As Samuel rushed to check on Neela's wounded arm, Carlson appeared in the doorway, pistol raised. "You ruined everything," he screamed. "My wife, my standing, my—" The shot was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, but it wasn't Carlson's gun that had fired. Ayanna stood behind him, Samuel's Colt in her hand, smoke rising from the barrel. Carlson looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with surprise, then collapsed. But he'd gotten his shot off first. Suki stood in the middle of the room, looking down at the blood spreading across her dress. She touched it with curious fingers, as if surprised by its warmth. "Suki." Samuel caught her as she fell, lowering her gently to the floor. Ayanna was there instantly, pressing cloth against the wound, calling for her medical supplies. But Samuel could see the truth in her eyes. The bullet had hit something vital. There was too much blood coming too fast. "Did I change it?" Suki asked, her voice already fading. "The dream. You saved us all," Samuel told her, holding her tight. "You brilliant, brave girl." She smiled, that mysterious smile that had haunted and healed him in equal measure. "I saw this too," she whispered, "but I also saw what comes after. Children, Samuel. Lots of children. Mixed blood, mixed heritage, completely loved." Her hand found his face, traced the line of a tear. He didn't know he was crying. "Don't bury yourself with me. Promise." "I promise." He choked out. She looked past him to where the other women had gathered, all of them crying. "Sisters," she said, "take care of him. He forgets to live without reminding." Then her eyes found something beyond them all, and she smiled with such radiance that for a moment the room seemed to fill with light. "Elizabeth says, 'Hello,'" she whispered, and then she was gone. The house fell silent except for the sound of weeping. Outside, the sheriff was arresting men. Hobson was directing the firefighting efforts. The barn was being saved. But inside, time had stopped around the body of a young Apache woman who'd given her life to save her family. Samuel held her long after she'd gone cold, the other women around him, their hands on his shoulders, their tears mixing with his. This was the price of their survival, not gold or land or pride, but blood. Young blood, brave blood that should have lived to see those children she'd dreamed. When dawn came, they buried Suki on the hill next to Elizabeth. The ceremony mixed Apache and Christian traditions, Ayanna singing death songs, while the sheriff's wife read from the Bible. Half the county had come, including many who'd been in the mob the night before, now shamed by what their hatred had nearly caused. Judge Hoffman spoke at the graveside. This young woman died defending her home and family against those who would deny her basic human dignity. Let her courage shame us all into being better than we were. As the crowd dispersed, the three remaining wives and Samuel stood alone by the grave. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and promise, but the beauty felt hollow. She saw this. Neela said quietly, "Knew it would happen." "And came anyway." Kaya added, respect heavy in her voice. "Because she also saw what comes after," Ayanna said, looking at Samuel. "Hope, future, life continuing despite the loss." Samuel knelt by the fresh grave, placed his hand on the earth. Two women he'd loved lay in this ground now. It seemed the hill was destined to hold his heart. But as he stood, he felt the living women around him, Ayanna's strength, Kaya's fierce protection, Neela's gentle presence. They'd all paid prices for this new life. They'd all chosen to stand and fight rather than run. "The town won't trouble us again," he said, knowing it was true. The mob's failure, Suki's sacrifice, Hobson's support, it had shifted something fundamental. They'd won the right to exist. But at what cost? Neela asked, voicing what they all felt. Samuel thought of Suki's last words, her vision of children playing in the yard. The cost was always going to be blood, he said. The question is whether we honor it by living or dishonor it by giving up. They walked back to the house together, past the burned but salvageable barn, past the bullet holes that would need patching, past the bloodstains that might never fully fade. The Triple Bar Cowboys had left food and supplies. Dr. Fielding had left medical equipment for Ayanna's practice. The sheriff had left a deputy to stand guard. The world had changed overnight. They were no longer outcasts, but survivors who'd earned their place through courage and loss. The price had been terrible, but the alternative, scattered, broken, destroyed, would have been worse. That night, as they sat around the table where Suki's chair stood empty, Samuel raised a glass of the mezcal Ayanna poured. To Suki, he said, who saw the future and chose to face it anyway. To Suki, the women echoed. As they drank, Samuel felt something shift inside him. The grief was there would always be there, but alongside it was determination. Suki had seen children in their future, mixed blood, mixed heritage, completely loved. He looked at his 3 remaining wives, these extraordinary women who'd chosen to stand with him against impossible odds. They'd survived the crucible. Now came the harder task, building the life Suki had died to protect. Tomorrow, he said, we start rebuilding. The barn, the house, everything. And, Ayanna, you should accept Dr. Fielding's offer. Open that practice. And if there are more threats, Kaya asked. Samuel's smile was grim but determined. Then they'll find us ready. Always ready. We've paid for this land in blood. Nobody takes it from us now. Outside, the desert wind sang through the canyon, carrying the smell of sage and rain. It sounded almost like a lullaby, almost like a promise. In the distance, a wolf howled, not a threat, but a declaration. We're here. We survive. We continue. Just like them. The months following Suki's death transformed the ranch in ways none of them could have predicted. Her sacrifice had become a watershed moment for the entire county, the point where blind hatred had shown its ugliest face and been rejected by decent people who'd finally seen too much. Dr. Marcus Fielding arrived every morning at dawn, working alongside Ayanna to establish what would become the territory's most successful medical practice. They converted the old bunkhouse into a proper clinic, with Hobson funding the renovation in exchange for treatment of his ranch hands. Within 3 months, people were traveling from 100 miles away to seek treatment from the unlikely partnership of a Harvard-trained physician and an Apache healer. She would have loved this. Ayanna said one morning, grinding herbs while Fielding updated patient records. They'd developed a seamless rhythm, his knowledge of anatomy and surgery, complementing her understanding of natural remedies and spiritual healing. Suki, Fielding asked. He'd never met her alive, but her story had become legend in the county. She dreamed of bridges. Ayanna replied, between worlds, between peoples. This clinic is that bridge. Samuel, meanwhile, had thrown himself into expanding the ranch with an energy that bordered on obsession. He'd hired 2 Apache men from the reservation, relatives of Kaya's, who needed work, and together they'd built a new barn, dug an additional well, and increased the cattle herd by half. The physical labor helped him process grief, each beam raised, and post set a small victory against the darkness that threatened to pull him under. But it was Neela who surprised everyone the most. The quiet, gentle woman who'd once seemed the most fragile had discovered steel in her spine. She'd taken over the ranch's business operations, her gift for numbers and organization turning their modest operation into something approaching prosperity. She negotiated contracts with the Army fort 40 miles south, securing beef sales at prices that made other ranchers green with envy. "You're frightening when you bargain," Samuel told her one evening as she tallied the month's earnings. She smiled, that soft expression that still fooled people into thinking her weak. My husband taught me that gentle voices often get better prices than loud ones. People lower their guard. It was Kaya who brought the news that would change everything again. She'd been hunting in the canyons when she encountered a group of Apache families, 7 women, 4 men, and 9 children who'd fled the reservation after their rations had been cut again. "They're starving," she reported, her usual stern demeanor cracked with emotion. "The children are skin and bones. They're hiding in Skeleton Cave, afraid to go forward or back." Samuel didn't hesitate. "Bring them here." "Sam," Ayana said carefully. Taking in 3 women was one thing, 20 people. "Will work," he said firmly. "We have the land, now the resources. And they need help." "The town," Neela started. "The town will accept it," Samuel interrupted. "They owe us that much. They owe Suki that much." So they brought them carefully, quietly, in small groups to avoid attention. The families were suspicious at first, unable to believe a white man would offer sanctuary without conditions. But when they saw Ayana, Kaya, and Neela working as equals, saw the Apache ranch hands eating at the same table as Samuel, something in them unclenched. The ranch became a small community almost overnight. They built additional houses using the adobe method, each family having their own space but sharing communal areas. The children, shy at first, soon filled the air with laughter and games. The women established gardens expanding on what Suki had started. The men worked the cattle and horses, their traditional knowledge of the land proving invaluable. It was one of these children, a girl of about 6, named Morning Star, who attached herself to Samuel with fierce devotion. She had lost her father to soldier bullets and her mother to grief sickness, and somehow decided that Samuel was safe. She followed him everywhere, chattering in a mix of Apache and broken English, helping with chores she was too small to actually accomplish. "You've been adopted," Kaya observed, watching Morning Star struggle to carry a saddle almost as big as herself because Samuel was carrying one. "Seems so," Samuel agreed, reaching down to take the saddle from the child, who beamed at him with gap-toothed joy. 3 months after the Apache families arrived, something unexpected happened. Neela came to Samuel one evening when he was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. She sat beside him closer than usual and took his hand. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. Samuel's world tilted. In all the chaos and survival and grief, he'd somehow forgotten that marriage, even unusual marriage, could lead to this. "Are you? Is it?" He couldn't form the question. "I'm happy," she said, answering what he couldn't ask. And terrified and sad that Suki won't see it. But yes, happy. That night, Samuel climbed the hill to the 2 graves. The wooden markers had been replaced with stone ones carved with words in both English and Apache. He sat between them, Elizabeth on one side, Suki on the other, and talked to them both. "I'm going to be a father," he said to the darkness. "Never thought. After you, Elizabeth, I never thought I'd have that chance. And Suki, you saw this, didn't you? The children you dreamed." The wind stirred the grass, and for a moment he could almost hear their voices, Elizabeth's gentle laugh, Suki's knowing hum. Approval, maybe, or just the wind, but it felt like blessing either way. When Neela's pregnancy became visible, the reaction from the town was mixed, but largely muted. The violence of that terrible night had sobered everyone. Mrs. Garrett still glared when they passed in town, but she kept her words to herself. The sheriff, whose daughter was now fully recovered thanks to Ayana's treatment, made a point of tipping his hat to them. And Hobson, ever practical, increased his orders for beef and horses, ensuring the ranch's continued prosperity. Dr. Fielding insisted on monitoring Neela's pregnancy, working with Ayana to combine modern medical knowledge with traditional Apache practices. The other Apache women rallied around her, sharing wisdom and remedies passed down through generations. "It takes a village," one of the elderly Apache women said, "but you have one now." And they did. The ranch had become something unprecedented in the territory, a mixed community where Apache and white traditional and modern somehow coexisted and even thrived. It wasn't without tensions, wasn't without problems, but it worked. The birth came on a spring morning when the desert was in full bloom, cacti flowers painting the landscape in impossible colors. Neela labored for 16 hours with Ayanna and Dr. Fielding, attending Kaya pacing like a caged wolf outside, and Samuel holding her hand until his fingers went numb. The baby, a boy, emerged screaming healthy and perfect with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes, a visible bridge between two worlds. "What do we name him?" Neela asked, exhausted but radiant. Samuel looked at his son, and thought of all the people who'd made this moment possible. "Robert," he said finally. "Robert Rising Hawk Kane." It was Suki's husband's Apache name, the one she'd shared in her stories. A way to honor the dead while celebrating the living. Kaya, who'd maintained her warrior's composure through everything, actually cried when she held the baby. "He's hope," she said simply. "Living, breathing hope." 6 months later, as autumn painted the desert in golds and reds, Ayanna came to Samuel with news of her own pregnancy. Then, to everyone's surprise, Kaya announced the same just weeks after. "Suki's dream," Neela said, watching her son crawl across the floor while her sisters' bellies grew. Children, lots of children, mixed blood, mixed heritage. Completely loved, Samuel finished. The ranch that had once been silent now rang with life. Children's voices in 2 languages, the sound of construction as more families arrived and built homes, the busy noise of a medical clinic that served the entire county, regardless of race or ability to pay. The territorial governor himself visited curious about reports of this unusual community. He arrived expecting to find either a scandal or a revolution. Instead, he found a functioning model of what the territory could become: diverse, prosperous, and peaceful. "You've done something remarkable here, Mr. Kane," he said, watching Apache and white children play together while their parents worked side by side. "We've survived," Samuel corrected. "Everything else grew from that." The governor stayed for dinner, sitting at a table where Apache women served food they'd grown and prepared, where conversation flowed in multiple languages, where a baby with mixed blood sat on his father's lap and reached for everything within his tiny grasp. "This could be the future," the governor mused, "if we're brave enough." "Bravery had nothing to do with it," Kaya said bluntly. "Desperation did. We came together because alone we would have died. Simple as that." But it wasn't simple, and they all knew it. It had taken sacrifice, Suki's life, the town's prejudices, everyone's preconceptions about what was possible. It had taken blood and tears and more courage than any of them had known they possessed. As the evening deepened and the governor prepared to leave, he asked Samuel one last question. "Do you ever regret it? This unconventional life you've chosen?" Samuel looked around the room at Ayanna discussing medical procedures with Fielding, at Kaya teaching a young boy to clean a rifle, at Neela singing softly to their son. He thought of Elizabeth in her grave, who'd wanted him to live. He thought of Suki, who'd seen this future and died to protect it. "Regret saved my life," he said finally. "These women, this family, this community, they brought me back from the dead. How could I regret resurrection?" That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Samuel walked the perimeter of his property. The ranch had grown from 40 acres to over 200, purchased with profits from cattle horses and Ayanna's medical practice. Buildings dotted the landscape: homes, barns, the clinic, a schoolhouse where children learned in both English and Apache. At the hill where Elizabeth and Suki lay, he found fresh flowers on both graves. The Apache women maintained them as carefully as they did everything else, understanding that the dead were part of the family too. "We did it," he said to the graves. Not the way any of us imagined, but we built something. Something that matters. The wind carried the sound of a coyote calling in the distance, and somewhere a baby cried his son or one of the other children who now called this place home. Samuel smiled and headed back to the house where his wives waited, where his son slept, where his future, complicated and beautiful and utterly unexpected, continued to unfold. The man who'd thought life was over had discovered it was just beginning. Different than before, stranger than he could have imagined, but real and vital and worth every battle they'd fought to achieve it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be other children born, other families arriving, other battles with those who couldn't accept what they'd built. But tonight, Samuel Kane stood on land earned with blood and tears, and love, surrounded by a family forged from loss and hope, and knew that Suki had been right. They were completely loved, and that was enough. 5 years had passed since Suki's death, and the ranch had become something none of them could have imagined in those desperate early days. What had started as 40 acres and a weathered shack was now a thriving community of 300 acres, 27 families, and 46 children who called the place home. The morning of the 5th anniversary found Samuel standing on the hill beside Elizabeth and Suki's graves, but he wasn't alone. His children stood with him, Robert, now 5 years old, holding his hand with the serious expression that made him look like a miniature version of his father. 3-year-old Anna, Ayana's daughter, picked wildflowers with focused determination, and the twins James and Sarakaya's unexpected blessing toddled on unsteady legs, more interested in chasing a butterfly than in the solemn occasion. "Tell us about Aunt Suki again," Robert asked, using the title they'd given to the woman he'd never met, but whose sacrifice had made his existence possible. Samuel knelt beside his son, gathering the other children close. "She was brave," he said simply. "The bravest person I ever knew. She saw the future, saw all of you, and decided you were worth fighting for. Like seeing tomorrow before it comes," Anna asked, her mother's intelligence already showing. "Exactly like that." "That's impossible," Robert declared with 5-year-old certainty. "So, was all of this once?" Samuel replied, gesturing to the community spread below them. The transformation was remarkable. Where once a single house had stood, now there was a small town. The medical clinic had expanded into a proper hospital, the first integrated facility in the territory. The school had 30 students taught by a young teacher from Boston who'd come west seeking adventure and found purpose. The Apache families had built a ceremonial ground where traditional dances and celebrations kept their culture alive while adapting to the new world they were helping to build. "Papa," Anna said, using the Apache words she'd learned first, "why do some people in town still look at us strange?" It was Ayana who answered, having climbed the hill with Kaya and Neela, all 3 women showing the gentle wear of motherhood and hard work. "Because we're showing them something new, little one, and new things can be scary." "But we're not scary," James protested, his face scrunched in confusion. Kaya laughed, ruffling his hair. "No, my fierce warrior, we're not scary. We're the future." They stood together on the hill, a family that defied every convention, every expectation, every prejudice of their time. 3 Apache women and 1 white man, bound by choice and circumstance, raising children who would grow up bilingual, bicultural, and utterly unaware that their existence was supposed to be impossible. The memorial service that afternoon drew an unexpected crowd. William Hobson came with his entire family. Sheriff Morrison brought his daughter Margaret, now a young woman studying to become a nurse under Ayana's tutelage. Dr. Fielding arrived with his new wife, a Mexican woman who'd faced her own share of prejudice before finding acceptance in this unusual community. Even Mrs. Garrett came, though she stood at the back, her face softer than it had been 5 years ago. The loss of her own son to fever the previous winter, and Ayana's tireless efforts to save him, despite their history, had changed something in her. Judge Hoffman, now in his late 70s, had asked to speak. He stood before the assembled crowd, his voice still strong despite his age. 5 years ago, I performed a marriage that many called blasphemy, 4 Apache widows and 1 white widower seeking survival in a world that wanted them dead or disappeared. I did it because I believed in law over prejudice, in human dignity over hatred. He paused, looking at the children playing at the edges of the crowd. I was wrong. A murmur went through the assembly. I was wrong to think it was just about survival. What Samuel Kane and these remarkable women have built isn't just a ranch or a community. It's a vision of what America could be, should be, will be, if we have the courage to allow it. He gestured to the hospital, the school, the thriving homes. Look around you. Apache and white Mexican and Chinese, all working together, all building something greater than the sum of its parts. This is the future, whether we're ready for it or not. The old judge's eyes found Samuel. Mr. Kane, you once told me that regret saved your life. I'd argue that love saved it. Love for these women, for these children, for this land, and what it could become. That's the miracle here. Not that you survived, but that you chose to truly live. As the afternoon wore on, the memorial service transformed into a celebration. The Apache families performed traditional dances, teaching the steps to anyone willing to learn. The Mexican families brought food that filled tables to groaning. The few Chinese workers from the railroad who'd settled here shared tea ceremony. And through it all, the children ran and played unconscious of the boundaries their very existence dissolved. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in those impossible shades of red and gold that made the landscape look like heaven's own artwork, Samuel found himself sitting with his wives on the porch of their expanded house. The original structure was still there, but rooms had been added, walls, pushed out space created for a family that had grown beyond anyone's imagination. She would have loved this, Neela said, bouncing her second child, a daughter named Hope, on her knee. Which she? Samuel asked with a slight smile. Elizabeth or Suki? Both, Ayanna answered. They both wanted you to live. Really live, not just survive. Kaya, ever practical even in sentiment, added, we've done more than live. We've thrived. The ranch is profitable. The community is stable. The children are healthy and educated. By any measure, we've succeeded. But at such a cost, Samuel said, his eyes drawn inevitably to the hill where 2 crosses stood against the darkening sky. Everything worth having costs, Ayanna said. The question is whether we honor that cost or waste it. A rider approached, a young Apache man named Thomas, who served as a messenger between the ranch and the reservation. He dismounted with barely contained excitement. Mr. Kane, Mrs. Ayanna, everyone news from Washington. Congress has passed the new Citizenship Act. Native Americans who accept allotment lands can become American citizens. Full citizens with voting rights and legal protection. The porch fell silent as the implications sank in. This changed everything. The legal limbo that had defined so many Apache lives, the constant threat of removal, or worse, it could end. There will be conditions, Kaya said skeptically. There always are. Yes, Thomas agreed. Land must be held individually, not communally. English must be spoken in official business. Children must attend approved schools. We already do all that, Neela pointed out. Our school is registered. Our land titles are individual. We speak both languages. Samuel stood pacing to the edge of the porch. This is what Suki saw. This is why she said the children would be different. They won't have to choose between worlds. They can be both legally, officially. It's not perfect, Ayanna warned. Citizenship doesn't erase prejudice. No, Samuel agreed, but it's a start, a foundation to build on. That night, they held a feast that brought the entire community together. The news of potential citizenship had spread, and while opinions were mixed, some saw it as opportunity, others As another form of erasure, there was hope in the air. Samuel stood to speak something he rarely did at gatherings. The crowd quieted. 5 years ago, 4 women came to my door seeking shelter. I thought I was saving them. The truth is, they saved me. From grief, from isolation, from a living death that was slowly killing me. He looked at each of his wives, at his children, at the faces of the community they'd built together. We've all lost something to get here. Family homes, traditions, certainties. Suki gave her life. Elizabeth gave her blessing from beyond. Each of you gave up something precious to build something new. He raised his glass water these days, since the children in a toast. To the future, to our children who will walk in both worlds without shame, to the sacrifices that brought us here, and to the choice we make every day to keep building, keep growing, keep proving that love is stronger than hate, that hope is stronger than fear. To family, Ayana added, raising her own glass. To survival, Kaya said. To home, Neela finished. The crowd echoed the toasts, a mixture of languages and accents, creating a symphony of human resilience. Later, much later, when the feast had ended and the children were asleep, Samuel walked once more to the hill. The moon was full, casting silver light across the graves. He knelt between them, his hands touching both markers. "We did it," he whispered. "Not the way any of us planned, but we did it. Elizabeth, your death taught me that love doesn't end with loss. Suki, your sacrifice taught me that some futures are worth dying for. Together, you taught me that life, real life, is about more than just breathing. It's about building something that matters, something that lasts." A coyote howled in the distance, and the desert wind carried the scent of sage and coming rain. Samuel stood looking back at the lights of his community, his family spread across the valley, like stars brought to earth. The man who'd thought life was over at 42 was now 51, father to 7 children, with another on the way, though Neela hadn't told him yet. Husband to 3 remarkable women and patriarch of a community that shouldn't exist but did. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The citizenship process would be complex. Some in the community would choose it, others wouldn't. The town's prejudice, while muted, hadn't disappeared. The children would face difficulties their parents couldn't fully imagine. But tonight, under the vast Arizona sky, with his family safe and his community thriving, Samuel Kane knew that every price paid had been worth it. Every sacrifice had led to this, a place where Apache and white traditional and modern past and future could coexist and even flourish. "Thank you," he said to the graves, to the sky, to whatever force had brought 4 desperate women to his door on that distant, fateful day. Then he walked back down the hill to the living, to the future, to the home that love and loss and impossible hope had built in the desert. The story that had begun with a middle-aged cowboy thinking life was over had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of human resilience, the strength found in unlikely families, and the truth that sometimes the best chapters of our lives begin after we think the book has ended. In the distance, a child laughed in their sleep, dreaming of tomorrow. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Samuel Kane dreamed of it too.